Caiaphas was the high priest during the time of Jesus. He was the most powerful, most influential person in Jerusalem, in Judea, and what we would consider ancient Israel. He was the guy. He was the connecting point between the nation of Israel and Rome. He was the person that communicated with Pilate or whoever the leader in the Roman garrison was at whatever point he was in leadership. But even more significant than that, Caiaphas was part of a family, and it's hard to describe the significance of this. Caiaphas was part of a family that controlled the temple, the politics, the religion, and the power of the temple for 40 years because his father-in-law was a high priest and 5 of his brothers-in-law were high priests. So this was basically a dynasty. They had all the power, they had all the influence, and they had extraordinary wealth. There were amazing financial perks that came with being at the epicenter of Jewish religion in the first century because Jews all over the world paid what was called a temple tax. And the equivalent of millions upon millions of dollars flowed into this 32-acre piece of real estate known as the temple in the middle of Jerusalem. So Caiaphas not only had extraordinary power, he had extraordinary influence because he had extraordinary access to extraordinary wealth. And things went along just fine for Caiaphas, the high priest, until a carpenter turned rabbi stepped onto the pages of history. We know him as Jesus Josephson. When Jesus showed up, here's the thing, and this is why you should read the Bible, you should read the New Testament. When Jesus showed up, the problem was, Caiaphas has all this power, he's got all this wealth, all this influence, he's in the family that controls everything. When Jesus showed up, the problem with Jesus was the crowds. It wasn't his teaching. People taught all kind of crazy things. It was the crowds. Everywhere Jesus went, there were crowds. We know the story from growing up in church, most of us, of Jesus feeding the 5,000. There were 5,000 men. People say there were 10,000 people. Some people say that's hyperbole. There were only 5,000 or 2,000. It doesn't matter. Everywhere Jesus went, there were at least hundreds and often thousands of people. And this was a threat to Rome, and this was a threat to the Jewish system because crowds meant potential insurrection, crowds meant division, crowds potentially meant civil war, crowds meant that things may not go well, and they may not go well quickly if a crowd suddenly turned on the Jewish leaders or turned on the Roman garrison. So the Romans were concerned about the crowd, and Caiaphas and his posse were concerned about the crowd, but everywhere Jesus went, he drew huge crowds. And Caiaphas and his group, they never drew a crowd, except on festival days. And they knew that people weren't there to see them or hear them. They were simply there because it was a festival. And the other thing that was a problem in terms of Jesus and his relationship with Caiaphas was that when Jesus spoke, and when Jesus acted and behaved, he spoke with such extraordinary authority. People were just amazed by his authority. In fact, remember that story of Jesus going into the temple and turning over the tables and chasing off all the cows and letting the doves go and, kind of wreaking havoc there and with the money changers in the temple. When the religious leaders sent by Caiaphas approached Jesus, they did not say, "What do you think you're doing?" They asked the question that they knew they needed to ask. They said, "Who do you think you are?" Because Jesus acted, behaved, and spoke with such extraordinary authority. But the other problem with Jesus is Jesus was extraordinarily critical of the religious leaders. Now, if you want to know what a Jesus rant looks and sounds like, if you get your Bible later, not now, and turn to Matthew chapter 23, it is a rant. Jesus had no respect for the temple leaders. Jesus had no respect because of the corruption that had happened inside the temple system by the time he showed up in history. He was all about criticizing it. And in Matthew 23, it just goes on and on and on. And at the end of this rant against these religious leaders, including Caiaphas, the high priest, here's what he says. This kind of caps it all off. He says, "You snakes, you brood of," this is Jesus talking. You wouldn't let your kids talk like this, okay? "You snakes, you brood of vipers, how will you escape being condemned to hell?" In other words, he says to the religious leaders, the people that get up every day and try to be good, the people who are responsible for leading the people who, oversee the sacrificing of animals so that they can find atonement for their sin. He looks at, quote, the best people in the city and he says, "You are going to hell." So it's no wonder that Caiaphas had a little problem with Jesus, his authority, the crowds, and his criticism of everybody that Caiaphas worked with and potentially had respect for. That Jesus threatened the peace and Jesus personally threatened the peace keepers. Now, this builds and builds and builds throughout the Gospels. You got to read it. And finally, there's a final straw. And the final straw between Jesus and Caiaphas and the final straw between Jesus and the temple leaders was not something that Jesus said. It was something that Jesus did. It was not a conversation. It was not a confrontation. It was an act of compassion. Jesus raised someone from the dead, and not just anyone. He raised a very famous citizen of Bethany, in the city of Bethany. He raised who from the dead? That's right, Lazarus. This was the final straw. What was the pinnacle of his miracles? What was the most amazing thing possible? Because not only had Lazarus died, Lazarus had been what? Buried. That's right. These people in Bethany had been to the funeral, and the next thing you know, they were seeing Lazarus walking around. So this was like over the top, and I mean, the crowd just swelled and swelled and swelled. And they realized, the religious leaders, and Caiaphas in particular, realized that their strategy was failing. And their strategy up to that time was to try to discredit Jesus publicly. That's why when you read the Gospels, they're constantly asking Jesus all these trick questions. And every time they think they've got him, Jesus comes back with a snappy answer, and they look stupid, and the people are like, go Jesus, you know? And so because what they were trying to do, the point of those questions was to try to divide Jesus from the crowd. They wanted Jesus to lose the crowd, because once Jesus loses the crowd, he is no longer a threat to the peace that they had established with Rome. So, for example, after Lazarus had been raised from the dead, here's what John, who saw all of this, was an eyewitness of all of this, here's what John writes. He says this in John chapter 12. Now the crowd that was with him when he called Lazarus from the tomb and raised him from the dead continued to spread the word. So this crowd of people that knew about this miracle, they're telling everybody in the vicinity. So many people, continues, many people, because they had heard that he had performed this sign, went out to meet him. So now you got a crowd and a bigger crowd and even a bigger crowd. And the Pharisees and the leaders of the temple are just throwing their hands up, and they're thinking, wow, where is this going? How is this ever going to end? So the Pharisees said to one another, see, this is getting us nowhere. And this was their strategy to try to discredit Jesus with the people by asking him all these tricky questions. It's getting us nowhere. Look how, and I love this. Look how the whole world has gone after him. Now, you need to know this. This is fast forward way ahead. In the book of Acts, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, the book of Acts that tells us what happened in the church after Jesus was raised from the dead, the book of Acts tells us, Luke, who investigated all these things, Luke tells us that many, many priests and Pharisees later became followers of Jesus. That's how John has the inside track to all this information. Later on, when John is investigating and Luke's investigating, some of these priests that eventually followed Jesus and some of these Pharisees that eventually became followers of Jesus said, John, you can't believe this meeting. We were so frustrated no matter what we did, no matter what we said, no matter what we came up with. Jesus made us look like fools over and over and over. And so John writes this in his gospel. Then we said at one point in one of those meetings, look, the whole world has gone after him, and surely they laughed out loud. Because little did they know, 2,000 years later, come on, a third. I mean, if they think their whole world went after Jesus in Judea, today a third of the world's population declares that Jesus is somebody special. A third of the world's population almost declares that Jesus is Lord. They had no idea what they were on the front end of. Immediately following Lazarus, the miracle of Lazarus coming back to life, there's another conversation that went like this. John records it. He says, then, right after they found out that Lazarus had been raised from the dead, then the chief priest and the Pharisees called a meeting of the Sanhedrin. Now, this means almost nothing to us, but let me tell you how significant this is. This is three different groups. There's a little bit of crossover. This is three different groups that did not get along. They didn't see eye to eye theologically. The Sadducees that were a part of this group, they didn't think there was such thing as a resurrection. The Pharisees, most of the Pharisees thought there was. They didn't get along politically. They didn't have the same idea about how Israel should relate to Rome. These three groups didn't get along. This would be like the House and the Senate, the Republicans and Democrats and the Supreme Court all coming together and agreeing on something. That's how significant this is, but that's how big of a threat they viewed Jesus to be. And so they said together in this meeting that John found out later about, what are we accomplishing? In other words, what are we doing? I mean, this is crazy. The harder we try, the bigger the crowds grow. What are we accomplishing, they ask. Here is this man performing many signs. If we, they're way overstepping their sense of authority and bounds. If we let him go on like this, as if they were the ones letting him go on like this, if we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him. To which we would say, yes, that's the point. They said, everyone will believe in him, and then what? Because in their heart of hearts, they knew. In their heart of hearts, they knew there was something about this they should pay attention to. In their heart of hearts, they knew that to resist Jesus was to resist God. But there was something, and this is where it gets really relevant and practical for all of us. There was something that was so important to them that to follow Jesus and to embrace this carpenter turned rabbi who claimed to be the Savior that eventually would claim to be the Savior of the world, to embrace Jesus as who Jesus claimed to be meant they would have to let go of something that was extraordinarily important to them, their power, their popularity, and in their case, their wealth. They knew what they needed to do, but it was just going to cost too much. They knew how they needed to respond, but the price was just too high. They continues, everyone will believe in him, and then the Romans will come, and they will take away both our temple and our nation. If we don't do something, we are going to lose everything that is important to us. And there we are. Because when you decide to follow Jesus, it's going to cost you something. In fact, as a Christian, when you finally decide, or from season to season, when things come up that are more important to you than your relationship with God, every single time you decide to put Jesus front and center in your life, every time I choose to do that, it's going to cost you something. And there they are. What do we do with Jesus? Everybody's following Jesus. He raised a man from the dead. I mean, that's your first cue. Follow him. When someone can raise people from the dead, you just get in line and follow that person, okay? This is not rocket science, right? But come on. This don't be too critical. But what had become life to them, what had become the center of gravity for them personally, was so important and so precious, the thought of giving it up. They just couldn't do it. Then one of them, and now we're introduced to Caiaphas actually in the story. Then one of them, Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year, spoke up and he said, because there's all this commotion, they're all arguing, what should we do, how do we handle this, what's another trick question, how do we get the crowds, how do we divide the crowds? And finally Caiaphas just has them all be quiet. He says, be silent. He says, you know nothing at all. None of you know anything. The priest, you don't know anything at all. Okay, the Sanhedrin, you don't know anything at all. You don't know anything at all. Here's what you don't understand. You do not realize that it would be better for you. You do not realize, group of powerful people, influential people, wealthy people, you do not realize it would be better for you that one man die. Forget all this trick question. Forget all this trying to separate the crowd from him. Forget all this trying to trip him up. It would be better for you that one man die, and then he realizes what he said. For the people. It would be better for the whole nation if one man die, not for us. It's not about us, guys. No, it's not about us. It's for the people. This is all about the people. So then, rather than that, the whole nation should perish. In other words, guys, this isn't complicated. If we get rid of one man, problem solved. If we get rid of one man, the nation is saved. If we get rid of this one guy, we are better. The nation is better off. Now, John is an old man when he's writing this, the Gospel of John. He's an old man. He's looking back. Many, many years have passed by since he experienced these events, and he's met these people, and he's had these incredible conversations. And John writes in his Gospel at this point, this is so powerful. He says, Caiaphas, did not say this on his own, but as high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the Jewish nation, and not only for that nation. Because John's got a grin on his face. It's like, wow, they had no idea what they were on the front end of. And not only for that nation, but also for the scattered children of God, to bring them together to make them one. And John is looking back and he's smiling and he's thinking, they plotted to destroy Jesus. They plotted to crucify Jesus. They plotted thinking they can put an end to this crazy Jesus movement. And little did they know that as they resisted him, they participated in the will of God. As they resisted Jesus, they actually facilitated the will of God as it would be demonstrated and carried out through the life and the death of Jesus. Because in the end, his death actually multiplied his influence. And that's why I said up front, at the end of the day, my life and your life, your life, your life, will ultimately illustrate the futility of resisting God. We will be illustrations of people who said yes, even though it cost me, or no, because it cost me. Yes, even though it cost me, or no, because it cost me too much. And in the end, we will each illustrate the futility of resisting God. And here's why: because you were not created for your glory. You were created for God's glory. And in the end, your life will in some way be a reflection of the truth and the glory of God. So John writes down, he just had to be grinning. And so from that day on, they plotted to, let's just say this word together, all of our campuses, to take his life. And John writes this and grinned. They thought they could take his life. They were way overestimating their ability, because a couple of chapters previously, Jesus had addressed this. Here's what Jesus said about taking his life. Here's what he said: the reason my Father loves me is that I lay down my life. The reason my Father loves me is that I lay down my life only to take it up again. No one takes it from me. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have, there's our word, authority. I have authority to lay it down and authority to take it up again. John must have grinned as they plotted to take the life of Jesus. Now, Caiaphas had a problem. You see, Rome would not execute anybody over a violation of Jewish law. If you violated a Jewish law, even if it demanded death, from the Old Testament, Rome ignored that part of the Jewish law. So he needed to come up with a charge that would give him an opportunity to take Jesus to Rome and say, hey, he hasn't just broken a Jewish law, he's broken a Roman law. In fact, he needed a charge of sedition, which meant he needed to be able to demonstrate to Pilate that Jesus was actually a threat not simply to the Jewish peace or the Roman peace, but the Roman Empire. And Jesus had claimed to be and would claim to be a king. And that's all Caiaphas needed. And so he pegged Jesus with the charge of sedition because he claimed to be a king. And he had Jesus crucified. The threat was eliminated. Their position in the nation and the city was secure. And then just as the sun rose on the first day of the week after Passover, there was a commotion outside of Caiaphas' home. And he heard someone running down the hall. And they threw open his door. And they said, "Sir, the body of the Jewish rabbi who we crucified is missing." What do you mean missing? A few days later, there would be reports of Jesus sightings all around the vicinity. A few weeks later, Jesus' closest followers would come out of hiding, and they would walk into the streets of Jerusalem, and they would say, "You crucified him. God raised him. We've seen him. Say you're sorry." And suddenly there were crowds and crowds and crowds of people. Now they aren't rallying around the person of Jesus. They're rallying around the name of Jesus, the reputation of Jesus, and the resurrection of Jesus. And Caiaphas and his cronies realized he's done more in his dying than he did in his living. And we were not able to take his life. And years later, Caiaphas lost his place. And years later, the Jewish people lost their temple. And as would happen time after time after time after time, those who would attempt to stand against and thwart the will of God simply became footnotes in the story of Jesus. And Caiaphas, Joseph Caiaphas, Jewish high priest, became a footnote in the story of Jesus of Nazareth. Now, what does that have to do with you and me? Everything. Because there's a little Caiaphas in all of us. There's a little Caiaphas in me that says preserve at all cost. Preserve reputation. Preserve that relationship that you know you should not be in, but it means so much to you right now. You would do anything to preserve it, and you find yourself thinking, God, either help me or get out of my way. Either help me get this right and keep this front and center, or get out of my way, don't bother me. Whatever it is that's in the center of your life, this is the thing that has replaced God in your life. A position, a GPA, that even if you have to cheat, you will not allow your GPA to suffer. There's something in all of us that says preserve, 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 preserve. But I want you to hear one thing, and if you haven't been paying attention, tune back in. And if you're on 2 or 3 screens at home, I want you to tune back in because this is really important. Okay, look up here. Whatever you have replaced God with in your life, whatever you have replaced God with in your life, whatever you have placed in the center of your life other than God, or if you're Christian, other than following Jesus as your Lord, whatever you have replaced God with in your life is already diminishing in value and significance. I can prove it to you. You see, your greatest regrets and my greatest regrets, your greatest regrets and my greatest regrets, your greatest regrets are connected to your attempts to preserve something that isn't even a part of your life anymore. Think about that. Your greatest regrets were an attempt to preserve something or someone that's not even a part of your life anymore. That thing, that relationship, that person was losing significance even as you clung tightly.